One of the great phrases of the Jesuits was, "You give me the child until he's 7 and I'll give you the man." The truth that adage pertains to, of course, is how malleable the young child's brain is. I mean, we absorb more information and our brains are more plastic. In other words, they're more malleable in early years of life than at any other time in our adult lives. And of course, neuroplasticity is true of all human beings at all times, but it's at its optimum levels in very early childhood. And of course, that's when this combination of biological factors and environmental factors combine.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jean Gerard. I'm a chartered psychologist and an investigative psychologist, and I also currently work at the University of Westminster, where I'm a lecturer in criminal psychology.
My name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist and an expert witness. My interest in psychiatry was first sparked when I was at medical school, and I did a placement on a psychiatric ward in Edinburgh. And everybody there had a fairly severe mental illness, and there was something fascinating about stepping into the world of these patients. Some of them had very bizarre delusional beliefs, and some of them were at their lowest ebb, for example, after suicide attempts. And then I started training in psychiatry, and I did a 6-month placement in a medium secure unit in North London, and everybody there had committed some level of extreme violence, and some of the patients there killed people. And for me, it was their backstories that really drew me in. There was always a reason why they ended up with a mental illness and a reason that they ended up committing murder, and oftentimes it was the same kind of confounding factors, poverty, drug abuse, and being victims of abuse themselves. So for me, it was piecing together the puzzle of why somebody ended up where they did.
It is Scotland Yard's Missing Persons Bureau which has the grim task of trying to pull together all the information on the thousands of people who simply disappear every year. At any one time, they have 600 bodies on their hands with simply no clues as to their identity. In most cases, they're homeless drifters who've lost all contact with their relatives. Some are never identified.
In the world of serial killers, sometimes killing can become an obsession. Some have a modus operandi, a particular method of killing their victims. And some target a specific demographic of people, while others become obsessed with what they do with the victim after the murder has taken place.
Mr. Lawrence repeated details of some of the evidence, the way Nilsen disposed of the bodies, living with them under the floorboards for months at a time, putting people's entrails in the garden for the neighbours' cats and dogs, boiling severed heads in a cooking pot. What stronger indication could you have of just how substantially the mind of this man is impaired, he said.
Dennis Nilsen was a Scottish serial killer and necrophile who murdered at least 12 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983. Nilsen would bathe, dress, and keep the bodies for days or weeks, talking to and sleeping beside them. He would often masturbate over or on the corpses, and when decomposition finally set in, he dismembered the bodies and disposed of them by flushing the remains down the toilet or boiling them to remove the flesh.
Nilsen's targets were all young men, certainly from 14 to 19. They were not mature men who were capable of perhaps fighting back or of understanding what he was doing, or of he preyed on their vulnerability and on their naivety, on their inexperience. And that's true in the first victim, Stephen Holmes, who was 14. He met him in a pub. By this time, Nilsen had gone to live in a flat in Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, North London. He met him in a local pub. The boy was trying to buy alcohol, but of course wasn't old enough, and the barman realised it. So Nilsen offered to buy it for him and plied him with alcohol, and then took him back to Melrose Avenue flat, where he proceeded to get him extremely drunk. Nilsen knew that he had to have this lifeless body. So he strangled him, and just to make sure he's dead, he drowned him. But he kept the body. He kept the body for about 8 months. He used to put it under the floorboards and then get it out, this young man, have sex with it. As I say, perhaps not penetrative, and then put it back. Like a friend. They would listen to music together. I know it may sound bizarre, but this is a fully grown man who's working as a clerk in a job centre, who goes home in the evening to sit with a dead body, the body of a boy he's killed.
Killers generally tend to target one particular socio-demographic group, and that can be because they've got hatred against that group for whatever reason. Could be related to their own earlier experiences, or it could be simply to decrease the risk. So for example, it's easier for men to attack younger or more frail individuals. Dennis Nilsen targeted young homosexual men. That could have been simply because he was sexually attracted to them, or it could be a bit more deeper than that. It could be due to internalizing his own shame and embarrassment about his own sexuality, so he projects this onto his victim.
Dennis had a deep shame when it came to his sexual orientation. Coming from a time when homophobia was rife, he felt forced to hide his true desires. But beneath that repression lay something far darker. Alongside his struggle with identity grew a fixation that blurred boundaries of age and consent, revealing not just a man battling shame, but one harboring deeply distorted desires.
Ephebophilia is what is called a chronophilia. So that is where people are attracted to a sort of age range, but it's not really an age range. It's more the characteristics associated with an age range. So ephebophilia corresponds to the age range of around 15 to 19 years old, more like the late teens. And this is the types of boys that Nilsen was particularly attracted to. The chronophilia that we most often have heard of is pedophilia, which is the attraction, the sexual attraction to children and prepubescent, where the body hasn't developed yet. So for Nilsen, he needed the body to have developed, but not have the body hair, which is something that he seems to be quite attracted to.
I think Nilsen was a man who stalked victims by night in a patch he knew very well, areas that he'd been to as a policeman, as a night guard. He loved the sordid, seamy life. He used to observe it. He's a voyeur of the underworld, if you like. And I think over the years, he grew so much a part of it that he wanted something more.
So, of course, I mean, it's common among serial killers for there to be a sexual component, and for that sexual component to be perverse. And the great psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud came up with the idea of polymorphous perversity to describe sexual desires which most people would classify as pathological or abnormal. And of course, necrophilia and the desire to have sex and to have sexual gratification on a dead body, of course, comes under that category.
Necrophilia is sexual attraction or even sexual activity with corpses. One of the biggest motivations for necrophilia is simply to have sexual relations with a non-resisting and a non-rejecting partner. And I think we see that in Nilsen's pattern of behaviour, the very fact that he would ply his victims with drugs and alcohol to make them sedated.
So necrophilia is not common. It's difficult to really assess the prevalence of it, the rate of it. But it is something that is quite uncommon. This is considered as a paraphilia, which is a sexual deviation.
Another motivation is simply for comfort and to decrease the feeling of isolation.
Nilsen's crimes shocked the nation, but they also raised questions about what shaped him. His childhood was steeped in loneliness, an absent father, a mother who offered little affection, and a young boy who found solace in isolation and fantasy. Over time, that isolation curdled into something dangerous. What began as a desperate need for connection evolved into a compulsion for control, one that would leave a trail of unimaginable horror behind closed doors.
We know that Dennis Nilsen's father wasn't present as he was growing up, and there's a couple of different effects that can have on a young, impressionable boy to grow up without a father. One thing is a general sense of rejection, so he might feel damaged. He might have this core belief that there's something wrong with me. And the other thing is insecurity and a lack of self-esteem.
So nowadays you have many more monoparental families, and his mother, Betty White, got married with his father, Olaf Nilsen, who took the name of Nilsen later on, who was a Norwegian soldier. And he was very often away, and he was during the war. So obviously he didn't have that paternal role, but the person who then took that sort of paternal father figure was then his grandfather, with whom he was very close.
Arguably, it's even worse when a young child has a father who's alive but chooses not to be present, because that child might think that they're in some way flawed, that they're being rejected because of who they are, that it's somehow their fault.
So he was living in a very domineering female household with his grandmother, his mother and his auntie, and he received most of his affection from his grandfather. But in his autobiography, what we also see is that Nilsen disclosed that over the year he could remember some memories, but couldn't really make sense of it because it happened when he was quite young. And he remembers going to the seaside with his grandfather, doing nice things, but he also remembered often going to an old war bunker where his grandfather was taking him, and often giving him what he was saying was some tea from a flask. And drinking that tea was making him very sleepy. And he can remember that his grandfather was then undressing him and was starting to touch his genital and fondling him. He also remembers that his grandfather used to bath him and sometimes took him in his bed, where he can remember acts of penetration. So in his autobiography, he is explaining the sexual abuse that he was subjected by his grandfather. So for him, there was also that person who was giving him love, care and affection was also sexually abusing him. He also said about his mother that his mother was quite cold and not really affectionate with him. So he was craving the company of someone and the love of someone that he was getting from his grandfather.
Research shows that around 93% of children who are sexually abused know their abuser. And in many cases, that person is a family member. The threat, it seems, often comes from within the home.
Dennis Nilsen claimed in his autobiography that he was sexually abused by his grandfather. Of course, we don't know whether that's true or not. But if it was true, then it's quite possible that that led to a huge inferiority complex. He would have felt like he was nothing more than an object for his abuser's desire. So that might have internalized this feeling of worthlessness, turning into this rage that eventually he wanted to take out on other people.
For him, there was also some confusion about what is right and what is wrong, because he didn't know that these sexual acts that were perpetrated on him were something that shouldn't be happening. Although he did know that his grandfather often told him that these were secrets, but he didn't necessarily realize what was happening to him until later on, when he was then able to process these events. And that then can lead to some confusion in terms of what is love, what is affection, and what is sexual abuse.
Dennis Nilsen was extraordinarily close to his grandfather, but when
When Dennis was 6, his grandfather died of a heart attack, and his mother took him to see his grandfather's body, and of course his grandfather was immobile, so he was a corpse. But his mother told him, it's okay, grandfather's only sleeping. But this image of his dead grandfather really stayed and embedded itself deep inside Dennis Nilsen's psyche, and he carried it into his adulthood. And there's no doubt that these early experiences played a part in Nilsen's, not just his killing, but the way that he did what he did to the corpses after they were dead.
Somewhere in that snapshot in his mind when he was 6, of seeing someone who had such power over him and yet now completely powerless, there was the genesis of the fantasy that was to come to stalk throughout Dennis Nilsen's life and give him the concept that the only way you get true sexual fulfillment is with a limp, unconscious, or even dead body.
At that age, it is very difficult to understand what death is and the permanency of death, because often you have children playing together, saying, oh, I'm killing you, and the child is falling on the floor, but they always come back. So this is where the children don't really understand, under 5-6 years old, the permanency of death. So when he was told by his mother that his grandfather had gone to a better place, he was a bit puzzled and wondered, why hasn't he taken with me then? That feeling of loss of his grandfather, he said in his autobiography that love and death fused in him. And that seems to be the sort of start for him of trying to understand his sexuality, trying to understand what is affection, what is love, through obviously the only relationship where he felt that he was cared and loved about. And he had that feeling of emptiness after his grandfather died, and he never really could find that until the moment where he started to kill his victim and was keeping his victim because they wouldn't abandon him because he killed them.
Nilsen was troubled by his own sexuality from quite a young age, and he didn't really know whether he was gay or straight. And so he decided to experiment with his brother and his sister. His sister didn't apparently notice anything, but his brother certainly did.
When he was playing with boys, boys were telling him about their attraction to girls, and then when he was playing with girls, he was then realizing that the girls were talking about their attraction to boys. So he didn't have a group that he could identify and share his feeling for other boys. So the only way for him to have some physical closeness to a boy was with his brother, as they were sharing a bed when they were children. So what he then was starting to do is waiting for his big brother to fall asleep and waiting to hear his breathing being much slower. And when he was sure that his brother was deeply asleep, this is when he started to undress him and then to touch him and just like discover the body of his brother.
Childhood is the time of sexual experimentation, and what sexual predators try and justify their behaviour is to say, well, children are always sexualised, and whereas children are obviously explore their sexuality as they grow up and as they enter into their, particularly obviously as they enter into their teenage years. This does not mean in any way, shape or form that they either want or indeed are ready for any kind of sexual contact or intrusion on their lives by a predatory adult.
It's not that unusual for young children to experiment sexually, but it is pretty unusual, warped even, to do it on somebody that's sleeping at the time.
Sexual exploration among children is normal, but sexual predation by adults is not and cannot be condoned.
And anyway, there was certain rivalry between them, and his brother started to describe him in the Scots slang as a hen, a woman, a girl, which didn't sit particularly well in the northeast of Scotland. These were, we're talking about the 50s, the 1950s. It was not something that was widely accepted. At that point, being gay was still a criminal offence in the United Kingdom.
For much of the 20th century, homosexuality in Britain was treated as both a crime and sickness. Men were imprisoned, outed, and humiliated under laws that criminalized same-sex relationships. In 1885, the Labouchet Amendment made gross indecency between men illegal, the same charge which Oscar Wilde was convicted of.
We have to remember, in 1953, the great mathematician Alan Turing was given a choice after being convicted of being a homosexual, of either chemical castration or imprisonment. Homosexuality was not legalized in the United Kingdom until 1967.
By the mid-20th century, psychology had begun to frame homosexuality as a disorder. Yet figures like Sigmund Freud and Havelock Ellis offered a more nuanced view, suggesting that same-sex desire was a natural variation of human sexuality, rather than a pathology to be cured.
Growing up to be a gay man in the 1950s and 1960s was therefore extraordinarily different.
Nilsen knew he wasn't somehow, didn't fit in, which is one reason why he decided very early, I think at 14, he started planning to go into the army.
Son asleep, drink over there, me here. Perhaps, crash, bang, what? Have a look at, move the camera up there, have a look at that. Right, look at the state of that, whole bloody ceiling falls down. Falls down on me for a start, rips straight across, hits the dog, poor old pooch, budgie goes up, big row, and it wakes you up as well.
Nilsen came from a happy but severely religious household. Swearing and the subject of sex were forbidden at all times, and Nilsen's childhood was spent in an atmosphere of self-denial. Believing that the British Army could offer an escape, Nilsen joined the Cadet Force, aged 14, enlisting for 9 years' service in September 1961. But his time in the Army also birthed some of Nilsen's darkest fantasies.
And there, for the first time, I think, he found himself able to do what he wanted. He trained to be a chef. He was apparently a very good cook.
So when he was in the army, this is when he started also to drink and realized that when they were very drunk, some of his army companions would just pass out in drunkenness. And that was sometimes for him the opportunity to start touching them when he was putting them in bed, but also for himself to be very passive and pretending to be unconscious through drink in the hope that he would be touched. He explained that this is really like the start of that duality process that he had. And really when he realized that the sexual pleasure that he could have and the intimacy that he could have would only be through having someone completely unconscious and someone passive.
And there's no doubt that this sense that Nilsen had of anchoring his sexuality in immobility was becoming deeply ingrained in him. And I think his experience of alcohol and the passivity that generated simply exacerbated that.
Beer I cannot stand, I got it for free at the bottle party.
Nilsen often drank to ease his shyness. While serving in West Germany, Nilsen drank himself into a stupor alongside a colleague and ended up in his flat. Although no sexual activity had occurred, the incident led to fantasies involving a young, slender male sexual partner who was unconscious or deceased.
Some people turn towards alcohol to help take the edge off social anxiety, so they drink on social occasions. And they do this because it actually decreases the degree of the internal concern and the worry, but also it develops a mild buzz, a sense of euphoria. So it's hard to be both slightly euphoric and anxious at the same time.
Chief Inspector Peter Jay read out the statement, which he said was in Nilsen's own handwriting. It was an attempt at self-analysis and his own description of his behaviour in what he called a condition induced by rapid and heavy ingestion of alcohol.
Alcohol is a very disinhibitory effect. So for people who might feel shy, who might struggle in social interaction, alcohol can help them to feel more confident. And for Nilsen, it seems to have been something that he needed to make contacts with his victims, but also he said in his autobiography that he needed alcohol as a disinhibition for killing the victims, and also for later on when he started to dismember the victim, to discard of the bodies. So for him, he needed that to go over any inhibitions that he might have had, because he knew that this was something that was wrong, but he couldn't stop himself.
There are, of course, a number of other high-profile serial killers who engaged in necrophilia, like Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy.
I had these obsessive desires and thoughts wanting to control them, to, I don't know how to put it, possess them permanently.
And that's why you killed them?
Right, right. Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A shy, withdrawn boy whose fascination with dead animals and anatomy hinted at something deeply disturbed. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered 17 young men and boys, many of them from marginalized communities. His methods were chillingly methodical. He lured victims to his home with promise of money or companionship, drugged them, and then strangled them. He dismembered their bodies, preserved skulls and organs as trophies, and, in some cases, engaged in necrophilia and cannibalism.
As my obsession grew, I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
Dahmer's ability to evade suspicion for over a decade was aided by indifference and prejudice within the system. For example, on May 27, 1991, after escaping from Dahmer in a naked, disoriented state, police unknowingly returned a bleeding, underage boy to Dahmer's apartment, dismissing the situation as a lover's quarrel. 14-year-old Connor Axon Thassamphone was later killed by Dahmer, and his skull was kept as a trophy. His crimes finally came to an end on July 2, 1991, when one of his intended victims escaped and led police back to the apartment. Inside, officers uncovered photographs, human remains, and evidence of unimaginable brutality. Dahmer confessed in exhaustive detail and was convicted of 15 accounts of murder, receiving 15 life sentences. But less than 3 years after his sentencing, he was killed in prison by another inmate in 1994. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the most disturbing in modern history. A portrait of unchecked obsession, human isolation, and the failures of a system that looked the other way until it was far too late. Many striking similarities have been drawn between Dahmer and Nilsen in terms of both their victimology and their modus operandi.
So they were both homosexuals, and finding their victims often at night, often young people who would be vulnerable. So for Nilsen, it was more people that might have had a drink, too many drinks sometimes, And for Dahmer, what would happen is that after the drink, he would slip some drugs in the drinks of his victims to take the victim home. So both were taking the victim home, and then both engaged in necrophilia. Jeffrey Dahmer also engaged with a few of his victims in cannibalism as well.
The most prominent British example of a necrophiliac is a man called John Christie, who lived at 10 Rillington Place in Notting Hill and was eventually tried and convicted and hanged for 7 murders. His upstairs lodger, Timothy Evans, having also been hanged for murder in the same house. In fact, it was one of the great and most famous miscarriages of justice in 20th century British legal history.
John Reginald Halliday Christie, known to his family and friends as Reg Christie, was an English serial killer and alleged necrophile, active during the 1940s and early 1950s. Christie murdered at least 8 people, including his own wife, Ethel, by strangling them in his flat at 10 Rillington Place, Notting Hill, London. Timothy John Evans, John's upstairs neighbor at the time, was wrongfully accused of murdering his wife Beryl and infant daughter Geraldine at their residence, and on March 9th, he was executed by hanging.
And Christie was a necrophiliac completely. He certainly did penetrate the bodies of his female victims.
Tonight, as usual, the streets of London will provide home and bed for hundreds, and the numbers continue to rise. Apart from the regular down and outs, there's a growing army of younger people looking for work or a new life. What they need is a secure home and a job, but often they're denied either.
Homeless people are quite easy targets for killers, simply because they're quite easy to find, they're in an unsafe environment in the first place, and also because, unfortunately, they don't have much of a social support. So if one goes missing, then people might not notice, or people might not care. Maybe society will turn a blind eye.
They've often deliberately cut all links with the past, and this makes them an easy target for exploitation by criminals or conmen. Now there's the increasing threat of violence, and this worries Nick Fenton, who runs the Centrepoint Refuge for homeless youngsters.
I think that that's probably one of the prices that some people will have to pay if they can't get themselves sorted out pretty fast when they come down to London. It's an increasingly violent place, and we are most concerned, particularly for young people.
Throughout history, some killers have gone beyond murder itself, driven not only to take life, but to possess it, to consume it, and to make it part of themselves. For Jeffrey Dahmer and Dennis Nilsen, death became a way to preserve love, control, and companionship. But they weren't alone. Across the world, others have walked the same disturbing path, guided by delusion, loneliness, and an obsession with flesh. In the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, police entered the home of Ed Gein in 1957 and stepped into a nightmare. Inside, they found furniture stitched from human skin, skulls used as bowls, and the remains of a missing woman. Gein had exhumed corpses from local graves, driven by a desperate desire to recreate his dead mother, the only person he had ever loved. Though he confessed to only 2 murders, his acts of necrophilia and mutilation became the blueprint for horror icons, from Psycho to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In Russia, Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov, murdered over 50 women and children between 1978 and 1990. Chikatilo was impotent, incapable of normal sexual intimacy. Killing became his only means of arousal.
So in terms of the actual pleasure and the thrill that a serial killer feels, it depends on what category they are. Disorganized serial killers tend to have this frenzy that needs to be quenched, whereas organized killers tend to enjoy the entire process, from the planning to the killing itself, to even taking little souvenirs with them so they can relive the experience. But for both categories, there's both a fear and an excitement intertwined. There's the fear that something might go wrong, or they might be caught by the police later, And of course, for many serial killers, especially males, there's a sexual gratification in the act itself.
After each murder, Chikatilo mutilated and cannibalized his victims, describing the feeling as an uncontrollable hunger that only blood could satisfy. His crimes revealed a disturbing overlap between sexual dysfunction and sadistic release, a recurring pattern in killers driven by internal torment.
So there has been some studies looking at what are the emotions felt by homicide offenders when they are killing. And most studies are more emphasizing on the negative emotions that are felt, such as guilt, such as shame, such as depression, anxiety. And only a few studies have talked about also some of the affects that they found positive in terms of thrill, in terms of that sort of rush of adrenaline that they felt when they killed. But not all have these sorts of emotions.
Andrei Chikatilo, the world's worst serial killer, was frog-marched into court this morning to hear a judge pronounce him guilty of killing and mutilating 52 women and children. Sitting handcuffed inside a specially constructed iron cage, he looked out on the mothers and families of his victims, many of whom have sat through every day of this 6-month trial.
But not all cannibals kill for pleasure. In 2001, Armin Meiwes, a German computer technician, placed an online advert looking for someone who wished to be eaten. To his astonishment, a man replied. The two met, recorded the encounter, and fulfilled the fantasy together. Meiwes later said he didn't see it as a murder, but as a form of ultimate connection. He wanted to be part of me forever, he said. It was the chilling modern evolution of the same desire that drove Dahmer and Nilsen, the need to own another human being completely.
With the emergence and evolution of the internet and social media, the way that certain criminals operate has also evolved. There are certain specific areas. So for example, con artists tend to use a scattergun approach where they will email thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of potential victims and try to lure them into transferring money. Sometimes these scams become actually quite sophisticated, so they build emails and websites that look very realistic, like they might have come from a bank, for example. There are other areas where crime has grown over the internet. So there is obviously grooming, where a sexual predator might contact a vulnerable or a young person and pretend to befriend them. And there's other forms of sex crimes that can be committed over the internet. So either hacking somebody's account or encouraging them to take sexualized pictures that they can use as blackmail in the future. And another element that has grown insidiously over the past decade or so is sex trafficking through the internet. So promising a vulnerable person, perhaps from a third world country, of a better life by creating this depiction of an idealized world on the internet. And then when they're actually trafficked over to the country, they're kidnapped and they're used sexually against their will.
Half a century earlier, in New York, Albert Fish tortured and killed children, writing to their families to describe how he cooked and ate their flesh. Fish believed his actions were guided by God. In his mind, pain and pleasure were indistinguishable. Suffering became his form of worship. Psychiatrists later described him as a living embodiment of masochism and sadism fused into one. From Gein to Dahmer, Nilsen to Meiwes, each of these men shared a haunting thread, an inability to connect with the living and a fascination with possessing the dead. Their crimes expose one of humanity's darkest truths, that love, loneliness, and desire can twist into something extremely violent.
Do you think it's important to understand the psychology of killers and why?
It's critical that we understand the psychology of killers, but it's also critical that we differentiate between killers who are far on the psychopathic spectrum and those that are capable of remorse and empathy. And most murderers are capable of remorse, and most murderers are capable of empathy, and most murderers are capable of reform. But that does not apply to psychopaths. It's important we understand that distinction. It's difficult to say whether psychopaths and serial killers are addicts in the sense, of being alcoholics or drug users. Or I don't think that's really pertinent. Although of course some of them are, but I think that the key thing that they're addicted to is control of other people, control of the world, and addicted really to their own sense of entitlement, their own narcissism, and addicted to the manipulation and destruction of other people. So there's no question that is a compulsive behaviour pattern among all serial killers.
Later in his life, through the format of tapes and various statements, Nilsen tried to explain how some of the situations and events from his life might have explained some of his future violence, some of his killings. But to me, it felt like he was trying to find reasons from his past to blame his actions and blame other people, such as his mother showing him his grandfather's body and saying he was asleep. It doesn't feel like somebody who's actually self-aware or somebody who's trying to gain insight or is reflecting on his actual crimes. It feels like he's trying to shift the blame onto somebody else. I think Dennis Nilsen was completely in control of his actions, and I think he knew what he was doing was wrong, because he put in so much time and effort into trying to hide the bodies afterwards. And if he truly didn't understand what he was doing was wrong, then why would he have gone to that effort?
There were several times where maybe the police could have arrested him, but the type of victims that he had targeted were vulnerable, and often people would then not follow up, or some of the victims who were not identified had no more contact with their families. So it was like they just disappeared and no one claimed them.
Do you believe that killers understand right from wrong?
Absolutely. I absolutely believe that killers can understand right from wrong, but they can't always stop. Killing becomes a compulsion. Once you have a taste for it, and the power that it gives you, the power over another human being, the ultimate control to take their lives, it is chilling. Once you get a taste for it, it's difficult to stop. But it is a compulsion, and that compulsion is usually driven by a fantasy in their childhood that's matured, flowered, and they're trying to live out that fantasy. I do not sympathise with killers. I try and understand them, and I try and understand what motivates them, but it doesn't give me sympathy for them, no. As far as I'm concerned, they've committed acts which are beyond the pale.